The chandelier caught the last light of the golden hour, scattering it in fragments across polished crystal and bone-white china. Laughter drifted from the dining room like perfume, delicate and layered, but sharp in the undertone, like something sprayed over something rotten. Then came the pause. A subtle silence. The kind that follows an unexpected presence. "She must be the friend Caroline mentioned," someone whispered. The room turned. Standing just inside the grand entryway, Ruth Harper shifted slightly beneath the weight of 6 stairs. Her gray cashmere sweater clung modestly to her frame, her red hair pulled back in a simple bun. She clutched a small clutch bag, matte black, no logo. No status. No signal. A blonde woman with diamond earrings that sparkled too loudly leaned forward. "Oh, you're Ruth," she said, her voice glazed in sweetness that cracked at the edges. "How charming. Come in." Ruth smiled politely and stepped forward. Her shoes didn't click. They whispered. As she moved to take the only empty chair at the table, the glances resumed, quick, calculated, assessing. The scent of judgment was heavier than the roses on the table. "Caroline said you're in furniture," another woman chimed in, swirling a glass of Pinot as if it added authority. "I design furniture," Ruth replied softly, settling into her chair. "That's so, hands-on," said another. "Do you do it all yourself? Like a workshop?" The question hung in the air like the punchline of a joke only they were in on. "I started that way," Ruth answered, keeping her gaze calm. "I still stay close to the process." "How rustic," came the follow-up. "That's adorable. Like a little artisan retreat." They laughed gently. The way people do when they're used to laughing at someone who won't fight back. Ruth reached for her water glass, her hand steady. But her thumb brushed the silver ring on her finger, a minimalist band with no stones, just a carved initial on the inside. She turned it once, twice. Not nervously. As if reminding herself of something that mattered more than this room. "So," said a woman with an embroidered clutch worth more than some cars, "do you ever sell your pieces? Or is it just passion work?" Ruth smiled faintly. "Both." "Oh, that's sweet. We love passion here," another said, raising her glass. The chandelier above them glimmered like a silent witness. Servers moved like ghosts, setting down plates of delicately arranged amuse-bouches. Ruth thanked one of them by name, Jason, who blinked in surprise and nodded. Victoria leaned forward now. Her voice was velvet, but her eyes were knives. "Tell me, Ruth. Do you have children?" Ruth shook her head. "No. I chose to focus on my company." Victoria smiled. "Well, some of us are lucky enough to have both." It wasn't the words. It was the weight behind them. The intent to cut. But Ruth didn't bleed. She reached for her napkin, unfolded it neatly, and laid it across her lap. "Luck," she said gently, "is an interesting word." Across the table, the women exchanged glances again, now amused and dismissive. Victoria leaned back, victorious in tone. "Well, not everyone can afford to live simply. Some of us work too hard for that luxury." A ripple of laughter. But Ruth just looked down at her plate. Then up. Her voice soft, but clear. "Simplicity isn't a compromise. It's a choice." They didn't understand. But they would. Because this quiet woman in gray wasn't just here for dinner. And the phone call that would change everything was only 30 minutes away. The sound of forks clinking against porcelain filled the space, but Ruth barely noticed the food. The conversation around her blurred into noise, a swirl of charity galas, beach houses, and the cost of custom closets. Her hands remained still in her lap, one thumb gently rubbing the inside of her ring, where the letter J was etched like a whisper. Her eyes lifted, just once, and caught her reflection in the polished silver of a candelabra. The same simple bun. The same gray sweater. The same woman who once spent nights sleeping in her own warehouse because she couldn't afford rent and payroll at the same time. She remembered the nights when the heating cut out, and she wrapped herself in old linen samples. The scent of sawdust had clung to her skin for years. She used to wonder if it would ever wash off. Ruth blinked, then reached for her water again, steady as ever. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "So, you live here now?" Bethany asked, tilting her head just slightly. Her earrings moved like small crystal pendulums. "I'm here for a few meetings," Ruth said softly. "What kind of meetings?" Victoria's smile was syrupy. Ruth met her gaze. "Business." "Oh," Diane murmured with mock interest. "Furniture business?" Ruth nodded without flinching. "Yes." She didn't elaborate. She never did. They wouldn't understand that those meetings involved teams of investment strategists and the transition of a $750 million portfolio. They wouldn't believe that a woman in a muted sweater could have walked out of a 12-hour negotiation with European buyers and left as the sole owner of a design empire. But Ruth didn't owe them that story. The real story wasn't about money. It was about building something when no one believed in you. When even your bank doubted you. When your parents said, maybe just try something safe. When your first employee quit because a woman boss didn't seem serious. It was about staying up past midnight sketching by hand because software was a luxury she couldn't afford yet. It was about driving across the country with a van full of prototypes, sleeping at truck stops, pitching to clients in hotel lobbies while wearing a blazer with stitched-up elbows. She'd made peace with being overlooked. Being underestimated had become her armor. Ruth took another sip of water and glanced across the table at Victoria, who was now recounting the saga of finding a reliable private chef. That armor had gotten heavier over the years. But tonight, it didn't feel like a shield. It felt like a weight. She had nothing to prove to these women. Yet the ache in her chest whispered something different. Something older. Maybe it wasn't them. Maybe it was the echo of all the rooms she'd entered in her life, carrying excellence dressed in modesty, and walked out with silence trailing behind her. Maybe she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Caroline's absence was beginning to stretch. Ruth had hoped her friend would arrive sooner, someone familiar, someone who wouldn't speak to her like a servant at her own table. But it didn't matter now. Ruth could hold her silence for hours. She'd done it before. She'd do it again. And when the time came, she wouldn't need to say much. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing a woman can do in a room like this is simply stay seated. Jason, the youngest of the servers, moved quietly through the dining room with practiced precision. His white gloves barely brushed the backs of chairs as he refilled glasses and cleared empty plates. He had been working events in Beverly Hills long enough to know who mattered, and who was pretending they did. Tonight felt different. It wasn't just the gold and glitter or the way the women's voices bounced like pearls dropped on marble. It was her. The woman in gray. She was the only guest who had looked him in the eye when she said thank you. Twice. And that small ring on her finger, the one she turned slowly under the table, it tugged at something in his memory. Something he couldn't quite place. Jason leaned down to gather the appetizer plates. As he reached Ruth's, she paused, then smiled gently. "This was beautiful," she said. He blinked. "Thank you, ma'am." "Ma'am." He said it out of habit, but it felt wrong. She didn't carry herself like someone who needed to be called anything. She just was. When he turned toward the kitchen, he caught a sliver of her reflection in the glass of a nearby wine cabinet. And suddenly he remembered. The Meridian chair. His mother had shown it to him in a glossy magazine, her finger tracing the lines of its curved wood and soft linen. She'd saved for 3 years to buy the coffee table from that same collection. He remembered her crying when it arrived, wrapped in velvet soft packaging with a handwritten note tucked inside. He remembered the signature. Harper. He looked back at the table. Ruth Harper. His breath caught. Could it be? No one else seemed to notice. They were too busy gossiping about someone's summer house in the Amalfi Coast and a friend's terrible facelift. He glanced again at Ruth. She hadn't heard the conversation. Or maybe she had, and simply chose not to engage. She sat quietly, sipping water, turning that ring with absent thought. Jason made a mental note to check the logo on that ring. The same one from the magazine. At the far end of the table, Victoria threw her head back in laughter, drawing all attention to herself once more. But Jason kept watching Ruth, just for a moment longer. The poise. The stillness. The quiet way she anchored the room without trying to. He stepped back into the kitchen, pulse slightly quickened. Meanwhile, in the dining room, Bethany leaned toward Diane. Something about her feels familiar, she whispered. Diane arched a brow. Like what? Bethany glanced at Ruth again. I don't know. Maybe it's the voice. Or the way she watches. Like she's used to reading people. Victoria chimed in from across the table. She probably just watches because she can't contribute. Laughter flickered again. But Ruth's gaze didn't waver. She took another quiet bite of her salad. Then looked toward the door, just once, as if sensing something was shifting. Somewhere outside, a phone was ringing. But the real call, the one no one saw coming, was already walking toward this room in the form of everything they had misjudged. The soft chime of porcelain and laughter was interrupted by a discreet voice from behind Ruth's chair. Excuse me, Miss Harper. You have a call. The gentleman said it's time sensitive. Ruth looked up calmly. Her eyes met Jason's for a brief second. He stood tall, composed, but there was a flicker of something behind his gaze. Recognition. Respect. Thank you, she said quietly, rising from her seat. As she stepped away, Victoria leaned toward the others, her voice dipped in syrup and mockery. Business call. Or maybe she's coordinating a couch delivery herself. Bethany snorted into her wine. In the hallway, the lights were lower, casting soft golden shadows along the crown molding. Ruth took the cordless phone from Jason, holding it with the same quiet confidence that had unnerved every woman in the room. Ruth Harper speaking. Miss Harper, this is Alan from Westfield Trust. Sorry to interrupt your evening, but we need your final approval on the transfer for tomorrow's acquisition. It's the 8-figure transaction we discussed. If you're ready, we'll execute first thing. Ruth's tone never changed. Yes, please proceed as planned. Excellent. We'll send a confirmation to your team. Thank you, Miss Harper. And, congratulations again. Thank you, Alan. She ended the call and handed the phone back to Jason, who hadn't moved. His voice was quieter now. Miss Harper, are you the designer of the Meridian collection? Her smile was small, almost private. Yes. He swallowed. My mother saved for years to buy one of your tables. She said it was the only piece of art she ever owned. Ruth's eyes softened. What's her name? Grace Martinez. I'll send her something from the new collection. Something special. Jason blinked, stunned. Really? Really, she said gently. But before he could say anything else, a sharp voice cut through the quiet. There you are. Diane appeared in the hallway, all sleek black dress and impatience. We were starting to think you'd snuck out the back door. Jason stepped aside. Ruth turned with a polite smile. Just handling a transaction. Well, Diane chuckled, linking her arm with Ruth's. My husband says a woman who takes business calls at dinner must not have a very strong team. Ruth said nothing. Back in the dining room, dessert had been served. The women barely looked up as Ruth returned to her seat. Caroline was still nowhere in sight. Bethany was fawning over Victoria's diamond bracelet, but Victoria glanced up when Ruth sat. Her smile curled. All good. Crisis averted. Yes, Ruth said, lifting her spoon. The lemon soufflé was light, elegant. The room buzzed around her. Then the dining room doors opened. Caroline entered with practiced grace, her black dress understated, her expression sharp. She scanned the room and smiled when her eyes landed on Ruth. You made it. She crossed the room, leaned down, and kissed Ruth on the cheek. I'm so glad you're here. Caroline turned to the table, smile unwavering. Ladies, I hope you've been kind to my oldest friend. Victoria smirked. Of course. Ruth's quite the mystery. Caroline's eyes narrowed slightly, reading the room faster than anyone expected. She walked to her seat beside Ruth and sat. You didn't tell them, did you? Ruth shook her head. Tell us what? Victoria's curiosity cracked through. Caroline tilted her head. None of you recognize her. Blank stares. She leaned in, disbelief in her voice. You're sitting next to Ruth Harper. The Ruth Harper. Silence. A pause, then a slow shift of glances. Bethany blinked. Harper Designs. Caroline laughed. Yes. Harper Designs. She built the brand. Founded it. Led it. Just sold it for, what was it? Ruth looked up, voice even. 752 million. The room froze. Victoria's face blanched. Her bracelet caught the light but lost its shine. But, your clothes, you said you just design furniture. I do, Ruth said. Or I did. Bethany looked stunned. That coffee table we ordered from Maison Verde. Mine, Ruth said gently. Victoria's voice barely rose. You didn't mention any of this. Ruth's tone never wavered. No one asked. And in that instant, the chandelier above seemed to glow a little colder. The women stared, blinking as the shape of the room changed, quietly, irrevocably. And everything they thought they knew about the woman in gray began to unravel. No one moved. The spoons resting against dessert plates suddenly seemed absurd. The soufflé had fallen. The warmth in the room had shifted, not gone cold, but clarified. Like steam evaporating off a mirror, revealing what was always there. Caroline stirred her coffee slowly, watching the women with a faint, knowing smile. Ruth sat with her back straight, her expression unchanged. She didn't look smug. She didn't lean into the revelation. She simply let it sit in the center of the table like another place setting, one they had failed to recognize. Victoria was the first to recover. Well, she began, her voice thinner than before, this is certainly a surprise. Ruth didn't look at her. She reached for her water instead. Diane jumped in, her tone suddenly brighter, too bright. I've always admired entrepreneurs. It takes such courage to build something from the ground up. Bethany nodded quickly. And Harper Designs, such clean lines, such presence. My decorator raved about your work. You've only ordered through designers, Ruth said softly, turning to Bethany. We've never actually met. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was revealing. Margaret cleared her throat. Ruth, if I may. I didn't mean to imply earlier that your work wasn't. You didn't imply, Ruth said, gently. You stated it. The room tensed again. But Ruth's voice held no heat. Just calm. I'm used to it. Victoria's fork hovered midair. Had we known who you were? That's exactly why I don't lead with it, Ruth interrupted, finally meeting her eyes. Because people always treat you differently once they think there's something to gain. She didn't say it with anger. She said it like a woman who had been in this room 1,000 times. A woman who had watched faces change the moment they recognized a logo, or saw her name in a magazine, or realized their husbands had once tried and failed to buy into her company. A woman who had grown accustomed to kindness that only bloomed after the smell of money. Caroline leaned back in her chair, clearly enjoying the reversal. "You know," she said, lifting her coffee cup, "I did warn you all that Ruth is impossible to define at a glance." No one responded. Diane reached for the bottle of wine. "Would anyone like another glass?" No one answered that either. Ruth looked around the table. Their body language had shifted, shoulders drawn in, smiles thinner, voices suddenly careful. But it wasn't their discomfort that mattered now. It was what they did next. She glanced at the bracelet on Victoria's wrist, the one she had flaunted earlier in the evening like a badge of status. Victoria caught her looking and adjusted it. It was a gift. Anniversary. Ruth nodded once. "It's beautiful." The grace in her voice landed like an echo. Because she didn't have to be gracious. But she chose to be. And that choice said more than her fortune ever could. The servers returned to clear the table. Jason paused beside Ruth for a moment, lowering his voice. "Your mother must be proud," he said quietly. Ruth looked up at him, surprised. Then smiled. "I hope so." He nodded once and walked away. The others watched the exchange, unsure what it meant, unsure how much more they had failed to see. For the first time all evening, Ruth felt no pressure to fill the silence. She simply sat in it. And let them listen to what it sounded like when power didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. The clinking of coffee cups echoed softer now, less like ritual and more like retreat. The women spoke in half-formed sentences, their words floating like nervous steam above lukewarm espresso. No one quite knew how to carry themselves. The air had changed. And Ruth had changed it. Caroline sat beside her, watching the unraveling with quiet grace. She reached across and gave Ruth's hand a gentle squeeze, no words, just pressure, just presence. Ruth returned the gesture with a barely there smile. A language only long friendship could translate. Across the table, Victoria had gone quiet. She no longer performed. No tossing of her hair. No dropping names. Just stillness. She stared at her empty saucer like it might give her permission to leave early. Bethany broke the silence first. "Ruth," she said softly, her voice missing its usual lilt, "that story about your mother saving for one of your pieces, that really stayed with me. I think my mom would have loved your designs too." Ruth nodded. "Then maybe you should gift her one." Bethany blinked. "Really? Pick something that reminds her of you. That's what furniture should do. It should hold memory." Diane spoke next, more hesitant. "I suppose we may not have made the best first impression." Ruth looked at her. "You made a very honest one." There was no venom in her tone. That made it worse. The truth, when unaccompanied by anger, hits deeper. "Look," Diane said, attempting a softer laugh, "we can't all be perfect." "No one's asking for perfect," Ruth replied. "Just kindness." Victoria stood up. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't flustered. She smoothed her dress and turned to Ruth. "I judged you." Ruth said nothing. "I did it quickly. Thoughtlessly. And I don't expect you to forgive that. But I needed to say it." Ruth regarded her carefully. "Why now?" Victoria paused. "Because I have a daughter. And I'd be horrified if she ever sat at a table and treated another woman the way I treated you." That caught Ruth slightly off guard. "I think she'd be proud of you for saying that," Ruth answered quietly. "No," Victoria replied. "She'll be proud of me if I show her I've changed." She sat back down. Not defeated. Just undone, and starting again. Ruth looked around the table. The room was quieter. Less decorative. Less sharp. She didn't know if she had forgiven them. She didn't know if that was even necessary. But she did know something had shifted. Not just in them. In her. Because for years, she had accepted being invisible as a tactic, as armor. Tonight reminded her that there was also value in being seen. Fully. Without decoration. Without defense. Jason returned with a delicate box. "Miss Harper, your car has arrived. Would you like me to bring this to the front?" Ruth rose, smoothing her sleeve. "Thank you, Jason. I'll take it." As she stepped toward the door, Caroline followed, offering her a light wrap. "I hope this evening didn't ruin your week." Ruth turned to her. "No," she said with a soft exhale. "It reminded me who I am. And who I never want to become." Outside, the evening air was cooler. A breeze rustled the roses in the planters by the steps. Ruth paused before getting into the car. From the doorway behind her, Victoria called gently. "If you ever do a new collection, I'd be honored to own a piece. And this time, I'd like to order it from you directly." Ruth looked back, her face calm and unshaken. "Let's see how you speak to strangers next time," she replied. The car door shut quietly. Not like an exit, but like a line being drawn between who she had to be and who she chose to be from this night forward. The sedan eased through the gates of Caroline's estate, its headlights casting long shadows across the stone drive. Inside, Ruth sat back against the leather seat, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the box Jason had handed her. She opened it. Inside lay a thank you card and a small envelope, a note from Caroline, handwritten, as elegant as she'd always been. "Ruth, you reminded them tonight, quietly, with grace, that power isn't loud, and wealth doesn't always wear gold. I'll always be proud to call you my friend." Ruth smiled faintly. The car stopped at a red light, and through the window, she caught sight of a small boutique gallery. Its window display was simple, just a single handcrafted chair illuminated by a soft spotlight. Her design. She hadn't even known they carried her latest line. In the reflection of the glass, she saw herself, still in the gray sweater, hair still tied in its practical bun, the ring still on her finger. But this time, she saw more than modesty. She saw legacy. As the car moved again, her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant. Final approval on the scholarship program, 40 full-ride apprenticeships for young artisans confirmed. Ruth typed a short reply. "Make it 50. She put the phone away and looked out into the darkening city, where thousands of lights blinked like distant conversations. Back at the dinner table, Caroline was clearing plates with the help of Jason. Victoria lingered at the edge of the room, looking quietly toward the empty chair Ruth had left behind. "She always was like that," Caroline said without looking up. Victoria turned. "Like what?" "Understated. But unforgettable." Victoria nodded slowly. Then something caught her eye. On the table, where Ruth had been seated, was a folded linen napkin. Perfectly creased. Tucked just beneath it, barely visible, was a calling card. She picked it up. Matte black. No logo. Just a single line in silver ink. "Real value speaks softly. RH." And in that moment, Victoria understood. The dinner party wasn't just an evening. It was a mirror. And Ruth hadn't come to prove anything. She had come to show them who they were. The quiet woman in gray had always been the loudest presence in the room. They just hadn't learned how to listen.